front mics, that would be great. And if we could put our hands together for Jasmin Paris.
Well, thanks everybody for coming. It's like an amazing turnout. It's great to be here. I'm going to start by just giving a little introduction to myself, because I'm aware that I've not really been to that many of the Carnethy kind of social events or races in the last few years since having children. So some people might not even know that I'm in Carnethy. I am. So, and some of you might have seen a few of these kind of slides before, so it'll be pretty brief. So just as an introduction to myself, I am a small animal vet. I work at the University of Edinburgh, and I do internal medicine, and I just treat cats and dogs for the most part. Although this is me doing an endoscopy on a baby alpaca that had pneumonia. So I think that's me looking what the airways, what was going on in the airways. But the majority of the time, it's just cats and dogs. So outside work, I'm a mum to two children. Rowan is my daughter, who's now 5, and Bryn, my son, who's 2.5. So they're a bit younger on that picture. And then we've got Moss, our border collie, who does all my training with me, and my husband, Conrad, who we don't get to run together as much anymore since having kids, but when we do, it's pretty fun. So as a family, we like to get outdoors. This is we've even managed to do a bit of running with the kids. This is a park run with the two of them, but for the most part, it's just venturing into the local hills. So this was the start of the Gypsy Glen race a couple of weekends ago with the kids, and it's really nice to get them walking in the hills. And the reason that gives me so much pleasure is that that's actually how I was introduced to the mountains. So this is some pictures of me. I think you might have seen these photos before. This was on a trip when my parents walked across part of the Andes with me, and they were carrying me on their backs. And my mum sees that photo of the river crossing, and she hates me showing it because she feels that they were very irresponsible at the time. But I think it's great because they were adventurous and kind of. I guess they showed me from a very early age. They kind of taught me to love the outdoors and love the mountains. So is that going to work? It's maybe stopped working. Yes, so my brother and I, through our childhood, spent lots of time outdoors, and we did lots of hiking trips both in the UK and in the Czech Republic, because I'm half Czech, and yeah, some pictures there. And I guess as we grew older and we became teenagers and then young adults, we started going on hiking trips all over Europe, really. We'd take a rucksack full of all our food we needed for 7 to 10 days, and then we'd wild camp, and we'd kind of aim to go to places that nobody else was, to kind of see as few people as possible. So those kind of trips introduced me to sort of, that's where I feel like I had these incredible adventures and really sort of learned something about myself and learned a bit about suffering, but also about kind of the incredible beauty and kind of the sort of joy and sort of exhilaration that being in the mountains can bring. So that was before I became a runner, and I didn't actually start running till I left university. So that was in 2008. And I ran for a year with a local club, Glossopdale Harriers. I was living at the time in the Peak District. And then I spent a year in Minnesota doing further training as residency. An internship working towards a residency in my chosen specialty. And then when I came back, I moved to Edinburgh to do my residency training. And that's when I joined Carnethy. So that was 2010. And I loved Carnethy. I loved the kind of inclusivity, and I just loved spending time in the mountains with similarly minded people in the hills. So that was me on the Two Brewers race up there on the left, and then at the end of the Pentland Skyline, quite early in my Carnethy days, and that's with my husband Conrad. So we met through Carnethy as well. And I quickly discovered that I liked running sort of the longer, rougher fell races, partly because it gave you a chance to sort of have a real journey, a day out on the hills. If you're travelling far away, it always seemed to me that it's better to spend the whole day outside on the hills, but also because you can have a chat and eat nice food and go slowly if you're running a long race. So I kind of discovered that I like doing those sorts of races. And in the years that followed, I did things like I started doing kind of more adventurous things. I ran the Dragon's Back, which is a multi-day race across kind of Wales. I did in 2016, I did some sky racing, and I ran the 3 UK fell rounds, the 24-hour rounds, so the Charlie Ramsey round, the Bob Graham and the Paddy Buckley. So yeah, quite a big year in 2016, and then the following year in 2017, I had my daughter Rowan, and I was looking up, that was me at Tinto Hill race, and then a few months later running in Ireland for the British Champs race with Rowan as a supporter. And then I think I've chatted about, in my last talk at Carnethy, I chatted about what happened next, because I ran the Montaigne Spine race in 2019 and spent quite a lot of it running with this chap, Eugenie, only to run away from him at the end. And that was the kind of reunion with my daughter at the end of that. So I think that kind of brings us up to date with what I chatted about last time, which means that I can now talk about things that have happened since. So later that summer, I ran the PTL with Conrad, my husband, and Jim Mann. So we had a great adventure there. And then the next summer, roughly sort of 3 months into COVID lockdown, my second child was born, Bryn. So this was us not long before that on the top of Castle, I think. So I'm just going to kind of describe a couple of things that happened after that, before Barkley, which is really the main talking point of this evening. And those two things are the Rigby round and then the 24-hour Munro record, because I realised I hadn't kind of chatted about them at all, and I think they kind of they were good preparation for running Barkley, and I think they were part of what fueled me to want to run Barkley. So the Rigby round, for those that aren't aware of it, is another one of these kind of mountain challenges. It encompasses about, I think it's 18 Munros in the Cairngorms, and it's a round that was run by Mark Rigby, I think in 1988 roughly, and following on from his kind of the way he did it in the first on that first attempt, since then the kind of ethos of the round is to run it with little support, little or no support, solo, and with little kind of prior reckonator of the route, so essentially on site. So I wanted to do the round the way it was intended to be run. So that's the route there, although that's not my route, that's John Ryan's and Graham Nash's trace. I just stole that because I found it on the Carnethy webpage. But this is what my round was like. The weather forecast was amazing, but this is actually what it looked like in fact, for about 20 of the 22 hours I was out. So it was probably the longest period. It took me 22 and a bit hours, and it was probably the longest I'd ever run on my own in one go, because even on the spine, the checkpoints were closer together than that. And it was certainly the longest I'd ever run on a compass bearing, because I ran the whole thing pretty much on a compass bearing. But I think that was really good preparation, because mentally for me, it was tough doing that. That was the first time I'd been away from my son for kind of that length of time after his birth. But it also gave me the self-confidence to think that I can navigate my way through a significant challenge and still come out of it at the other end, having achieved what I set out to do. So later the same summer, I attempted the 24-hour Munro challenge. So for those of you that have probably been to Carnethy talks in the kind of recent past, will probably have heard Sasha talking about. I think he talked about his record breaking attempt at the 24-hour Munro challenge. So when I attempted it in 2021, there was the men's record had been broken several times. Initially Jim Mann ran 20 Munros, ran 30, then Sasha I think ran 32, and then Kim Collinson ran 33. But there was no female record for the 24-hour Munro challenge. So I sort of felt that there should be one. So I attempted that. And one of the reasons I wanted to mention it here was that I was supported throughout that day by a fantastic team of Carnethys, and I really kind of wanted to use the opportunity to say thank you for that. So this picture's there to remind me to also say thank you to my mum, because she's looked after the children for those 24 hours that I was away, but also made fantastic cakes for all the supporters. So those are Czech kind of breakfast cakes that were excellent. So I ran the first leg with Jim, Man and Conrad, and we had this fantastic sunrise. That was the first leg over kind of the Lochnagar Munros and the Glenshee Munros, and that was going into sunrise. And then the second leg from Glenshee over to White Bridge, and that was with Ali Bevan and Sasha. And it was getting pretty hot then, so we kind of, every time I came to a stream or a river, I lay down in it. And the third leg I ran with Owen Lennon and Ali Mason. So that was me, I think, at Currabothi, lying in the river there. And then the fourth leg, it was mainly Graham Nash and John Ryan that kind of nursed me through the fourth leg when I was kind of, pretty slow. And they're the ones that forced me to run pretty fast at the end when we got a bit lost and it was looking like we weren't going to make it back in time. So that's John Ryan there and me celebrating the fact that we'd made it back in time. So it was 29 Munros in just under 24 hours. I think it was 23:48. And the reason I'm mentioning it here as well is because I think there's lots of Carnathy ladies that have that could break this record. So hopefully by raising awareness of it today, it will inspire other Carnathy ladies to have a go, because it's certainly breakable. Okay. So before I go on to talk about Barkley, if anybody's got any questions at any point, either ask them, put your hands up and shout them at me, or save them for the end, because be very happy to take any questions then. So going on to the main subject of the talk, which is the Barkley Marathons. So people probably are aware that I sort of got back from my second attempt at the Barkley Marathons about 4 weeks ago. So just as a rough show of hands, how many people kind of have heard of the Barkley Marathons and know about it? So I thought that probably most people would. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, just in case you don't know all the facts. So it's a race that it's run in Tennessee, which apparently is there on the map. I tried to, before this race, I didn't really know much about Tennessee or what it was famous for. So I looked it up, and apparently it's famous because it was where Elvis Presley came from, and also Dolly Parton. So there you go, something you've learned something tonight. Apart from, so it's set in Tennessee, and it takes place in the Frozen Head State Park. So there's a couple of pictures that I just got from Wikipedia on showing you roughly what it looks like in the park. So you can see, I would say that quite a lot of it is actually, the terrain is fairly similar, like the kind of trees are fairly similar to this. In other places, they're much more closely kind of bunched together, but there's a fair amount of it where the trees are actually not that, they're not, it's not like you're densely having to push your way through undergrowth if you're running the right way. Which is, definitely a point. But yeah, kind of, it's really a sort of unspoilt woodland. It's quite wild, because in the States, you're allowed to walk on the trails, but you're not allowed off the trails at all. So in fact, Conrad had one of the park rangers point a gun at him, he was walking along the trail. He said, you're not allowed to leave the trail, pointing a gun at him. So they're pretty strict on enforcing these rules. So the rest of the park, the part that's not on the trails, is really quite wild. But yeah, the whole of the park essentially is forested. There's very little open area. So the race originated when Gary Cantrell, who's now known as Laz, and his friend, they came up with the idea based on this event when this prisoner, James Earl Ray, who was the prisoner, he was the man that shot Martin Luther King Jr. He escaped from this prison in Frozen Head State Park, or right in the Bushy Mountain State Prison, and he spent 55 hours on the loose, and in that time he managed to cover 12 miles, and as a result, Laz sort of joked with his friend, I bet I could cover 100 miles in that time, and that was basically that was kind of the basis on which this race was set. And I think the first year, Laz and his friend, who was I think known as Raw Dog, hiked one loop of this race, and then the following year it started properly. So that was in 1986 was when it first started. And there was initially a period where it was a shorter race. It involved about 55 miles, and then it progressed to being the full long race, which was first completed in 1995 by somebody from the UK called Mark Williams. So, in essence, the race, what it consists of, it's roughly 100 miles long, but it could be significantly more. It's made, some people estimate 130 miles, somewhere between 100 and 130 miles probably, if you do the 5 loops. And each loop has maybe 4,500 meters of ascent, but nobody really knows because you're not allowed to take any sort of a device to measure where you've been and how far you've climbed. So yeah, it's unclear, but it's a lot of ascent. That's, you know, if you're thinking 100 miles with maybe 20,000 meters of ascent, that's probably double the UTMB. So you're pretty much always going up or down. So you start at this campsite here. Laz books out the campsite, and all the competitors kind of accumulate there a couple of days before the race or the day before. And this is where it all starts. There's this yellow gate, this famous yellow gate, and this is where the race starts from, and this is where you have to get back to at the end of every loop. So it's to complete the course, you need to run 5 loops. If you manage to complete 3 loops, in 40 hours, that's what's known as a fun run. I would debate the fact that it's the naming, I think, it leaves a little bit to be desired. But the 5 loops, if you want to do the whole thing, need to be completed in 60 hours. And that means that you need to have done, you know, each cumulative has to be within 12. So 12 hours for the first loop, 24 to have done 2 loops, 36 to have done 3 loops, 4 loops have to have been done in 48 hours, and so on. Yeah, you start, the loops can be, usually the first loop's clockwise, but after that Laz might say one year that he wants 2 loops to be clockwise and then 2 loops to be anti-clockwise, and then the final loop is always determined by your order of getting back. So usually, for the majority of the times, nobody gets to the final loop. But if, like this year, multiple people do, then the first person to get back decides which way round they want to go, and then the next person has to go the opposite way. And it's Laz's way of making sure that people aren't going to be able to team up and run together on the final loop, because it's a big advantage to be with somebody. And in general, there is one direction that's easier than the other direction, just because it avoids the 2 worst climbs, I guess, are on a specific loop, the anti-clockwise loop. Yeah, what else to say? Since it's been started, now as of this year, 17 people have finished it, and no ladies have ever finished it. So prior to this year, the longest that a lady had managed to do was 3 loops and then I think 2 books. So that was Sue Johnson, I think. I think that's what I was going to say from that. So this is, so one kind of quirk about this race is that rather than having checkpoints on the way round, you have to search for books. And Laz chooses books each year that he must spend the whole year collecting the books up. But he chooses books that have these kind of really depressing titles. So there's things like Rising Darkness and Abandon Hope and Things Fall Apart and When All Hope Fails and that sort of thing, The Bad Beginning. So he chooses these books, and occasionally, usually you're too focused on just trying to get your page and moving on, but occasionally you'll look at the title of it and be amused or horrified, as befits your mood. So what happens is that at the start of each loop you get given a number, and that determines the page you have to pull out from each book as you go along. So this is just one of the loops that had number 97. So that meant that at each book I had to pull out page 97. So he only gives out odd numbers, obviously, so that because you'll be pulling out both pages. It's interesting, actually, because for the first loop it doesn't matter because there's so many people. There's 40 people that start the race each year. It's just 40. But usually by the second or third loop, certainly there's a much smaller number, maybe five or 5 to 7 or 5 to 8 by the third loop. And then he gives out the numbers in order. So you actually have an idea according to who's taken the page in front of your, whether you've moved ahead of somebody. So for example, this year, when I was running the third loop, as I came up to the first book, I was running with a guy called Joe McConaughey, who's like really friendly, kind of bouncy sort of chap. And he was clearly wanting to catch the people up front. So we found our pages, found the book together, got our pages, and he kind of bounded off down the hill, and I waved goodbye and wished him well. And then I got to the next book, and his page was still there. So somewhere in between that book and the next book, he'd gone awry. And then, I didn't see him again for another 12 hours or whatever. And I saw him as I was going back out for the next loop, I think. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that this kind of, where the pages become almost a register of where you are on the race. And if you're getting lost and the person behind you overtakes you, because their page is gone, for example.
You've got a different number each loop.
Yeah. So I think that's what I was going to say about pages. So this is borrowed from a book that's recently been published called In the Spell of the Barkley by Michael Pagnuson. But this is just, I thought this map was useful because it reminded me to tell you about some of the names. So these names aren't on the map. Like the map is, these are Barkley names that have come, and some of them have developed from kind of stories of what's happened in the past on the course. So somebody might have fallen down somewhere. I think Leonard's butt slide is literally that he slid down there. But you can imagine what Leonard's butt slide is like. It's super steep. Like you can't avoid sliding down it on your butt. So there's big hell and there's little hell, and there's testicle spectacle wasn't on it this year because that was one of the variations. The course tends to change a bit each year, and when somebody finishes it, then it always changes a bit. But the general kind of gist of it is roughly the same. I think there was one year somebody got onto the course and filmed a bit of it, so then Laz changed all of that. So that's part of the mystery, part of the kind of magic of it, I guess, is the mystery behind it. So he does take great care to kind of protect that, and hopefully, I think people, when they're talking about it and things, will continue to take care and not kind of give away the secrets, because, as I say, that's kind of part of the challenge of it. So there's, yeah.
They're looks like they're Munro heights, but so what's the altitude that you go down to? Is it like sea level, or is it, how high is the start?
That's a good question, actually. I think that the climbs you're doing are like 500-600 meters or so. Like they're not like, you're not climbing 1,000 meters with each climb. I have to check exactly how high. I don't know. Probably the longest, like the climbs, you might be climbing for an hour or something, but then it's pretty tough going. So, but usually less than that. So I don't think it's less than 1,000 meters, obviously, because I think it's about 500 meters. So the race starts, so people might have heard of the conch thing. So the race starts, you don't know when the race is going to start. That's one of the kind of challenges. That's one of the quirks about this race. You know there's a 12-hour window, which so it could start anywhere between midnight and noon the next day. So you go to bed in the evening, not knowing if you're going to bed for like 3 hours or whether you're going to bed for 15 hours. And that's actually, that is surprising how much that messes with your head, because you lie down, you not know whether you're going to kind of be jumping up in a moment, and whether you should eat a big meal in the evening or you're just going to be about to start running. So what happens is during that 12-hour window, at some point, Laz blows his conch, and it's actually a pretty loud noise. And then from the moment he blows that conch, you have an hour before the start of the race. And during that time, you get given a watch. So you're not allowed to take you're not allowed to take your own watch, phone, nothing. No way of charting where you are whatsoever. But you get given a watch, but it's like, he buys 40 of these watches. They're all a bit different. And they're all set. So they'll be set for 00 at the time he wants to start the race. And this year, I think some people were trying to like work out whether they could set an alarm on the watch, because the problem is you get really sleep deprived and you want to have a power nap, but you have no way of waking yourself up because you've got no watch with you, you've got no alarm. So I think people tried and failed to do that. I personally would be really terrified of losing the watch face that told me what time it was. So I didn't try and change anything on the watch. And then at that point when Laz starts the race, he lights a cigarette and then you go. So at that kind of 1 hour after the conch is blown, he lights his cigarette and off you go. Yeah. So I ran the Barkley Marathons for the first time in last year and then again this year. So I'll just talk you through both kind of occasions. And as I say, at the end you can ask me questions, so then hopefully anything that I've forgotten will come up then. So first, I guess I get asked quite a lot why I wanted to run the Barkley Marathons. And it's interesting. So it's sometime in 2021, that summer when I ran the Rigby Round and I ran the Munros, at some point then I just suddenly had this realisation that I wanted to attempt the Barkley Marathons. And it's something that I'd known about, I guess, peripherally for quite a long time, but it had been more it'd been brought to my attention after the Spine, because I did quite a few interviews and people asked me repeatedly whether I would try the Barkley Marathons. And Laz himself was actually interviewed at one point and people asked him and he sort of made it clear that he'd be interested in me coming to try the Barkley Marathon. So I sort of became more aware of it then. But it was a bit like with the Spine. I had this, initially when I heard about it, I thought, why would you want to do that? It just sounds like misery. And why would you want to put yourself through that? And also running loops, like the idea of running loops and then doing the same thing again. It just didn't appeal to me. But I think as time went on, there's this little voice in your head saying, how can it be that hard? And like, could you do it? Could you, could you have a go and how would you be able to do? And I think, and I'm sure that you'll share this, there's like some innate, like sort of tantalizing aspect to attempting something that you think you probably can't do, but it's just possible. I think that's what the kind of magic of Barkley is, that it's just possible. He aims for this sort of 1% finish rate, so you know that it's going to be extremely difficult, but that it's just there. The possibility is just there. For me, that's really it's really enthralling and exciting, and it sort of tempts me to have a go. And I also think that by attempting things like this, you know that you're going to hit a wall, and you know that you're going to have to sort of go through that. And there's something, I find there's something kind of exciting about that as well. So those are the reasons that I wanted to have a go. So I found myself there in March 2022 for the first time. This is a picture of the Rat Jaw, which is the only place on the course where supporters are allowed to be. So this is the only place that you're allowed to see anyone through the whole time that you're out on the course. And it goes, essentially this climb comes up to a fire tower where the supporters can be standing, but they're not allowed to say anything to you at that point. At all. They tend to say well done, but they're not allowed to tell you where anyone else is or give you any updates about the race at all. So this is back to the Pentlands. This is just to remind me to mention, so my training that year, it was actually the weather was really awful last January, February, for anyone that remembers, and we had like storm after storm. So the weather was pretty kind of helpful in terms of training mental fortitude and resilience, and it also was super windy, so I was actually quite scared running in the Pentlands quite a lot of the time. So one particular morning when it was super windy, I ran up Castle Law 22 times, which and then up Alamure as well, and it ended up, so it might have been affected by the wind, but my cumulative ascent was 5,500 meters for 7.5 hours or something of running up and down. And my dog Moss, just by the end, he was just sitting in the middle of the hill, and he didn't he just waited for me to come back down, because he was like, you're gonna go again. So that was, so my training, I did that, and then I did some other kind of quirky things. My mum made a little Barkley Marathons for me around Rosewell. It's surprising how wild terrain she can manage to find, Rosewell towards Arniston. We were in the Czech Republic over Christmas, and my brother made a Barkley Marathons there, complete with kind of magazines to tear pages out of. And we did loops back to our cottage. So I kind of had the support of my family in trying to get ready. But the bigger days were mainly in the Pentlands. So in your first year at the Barkley, you need to take a number plate from your country where you came from. So I think this was the year that Nikki ran it, because this is her number plate here, was this one, meat, because she's a dairy farmer. I didn't have anything exciting. My dad actually found the number plate in the ditch. But it was Scottish. So that was my number plate. So if you've been before, you need to take something else. So usually every year Laz says what he wants brought. So if he needs like flannel shirts, he'll say, bring me a flannel shirt. And if he wants, socks, he says, bring me a pair of socks. So that's the way he tops up his wardrobe each year, is by asking for a particular gift. The entry fee for the race is just $1.60. It's insane. And then, generally there's an understanding that you'll contribute something towards the kind of camp costs, but that's not part of the entry for the race.
Is there a reason why it's 160, or is it just completely random?
I don't know. The race has a lot of these things where you don't actually know. I think that's part of what, it's part of the kind of, I think a lot of what Laz does is he sets up these kind of mind games for you, and that's the thing with the race start. It's not actually a challenge, but it's mentally, it starts to mess you up. So the more of these things that come on top of each other, so you just have to ignore that and just focus on the thing and not let it phase you, I think. And that's the part of the things that he sets up to kind of like trip you up along the way. I personally think I think people kind of wonder whether Laz is like what sort of a guy he is. So if you were going to ask that question, I think he's really smart. I think he's got he knows what kind of what people are after, and sort of he's intrigued by what kind of humans can do, and also he gets this sort of desire that people have to sort of challenge themselves and to test how far they can go. And that's, I think, what he's sort of created that with Barkley. But he does this other race as well. He does this like backyard ultra where competitors run like four miles, and then they have the rest of, however, every hour they run sort of 4 miles, and then at the start of each next hour they have to do it again. And it gets to crazy distances and crazy number of hours, and then it usually gets down to a couple of competitors, and then it's all about mental strength, because you're actually only competing against the other person that's still in the race. The minute they stop, then the race ends. So that's the sort of thing he comes up with, these like incredible ideas. Pardon?
What age is he?
I think he must be. I don't actually know. I'm guessing 70s, but I'm not sure.
And how do you apply or get selected?
Yeah, that's also not something that it's very clear. There's no website for the race. There's no, and I'm obviously not going to say it here. But the kind of bit that's known is that you need to write this essay saying why you want to run Barkley. And then you'll have to find out yourself. So the first year I ran it, I also took Laz this spoon, which my mum carved. This is like huge wooden spoon she carved. And somebody took a photo of it and sent it to me as a tweet afterwards. And I gave it to Laz. I think the night before the race starts, there's this barbecue, and there's this chicken that gets made on the barbecue. And it's always like, it's frozen when it starts, and then it goes straight on the barbecue from frozen. So all of the, I think if you're there to race, you have to have a screw loose to eat it. So my mum's, I think, suggestion was that he could make a stew, but he picked this spoon up and immediately said, "Oh, this will be excellent for ice cream." And it's like this big, the kind of the scoop of it. So I don't know if he's eating ice cream with it anymore, but if he is, he'll be getting decent portions. So this is the first year I ran the race, and I'll just quickly go through what happened that first year. So on the first loop, I ran part of it, I think about 2/3 of the loop, I ran with people, especially with Guillaume, who was really helpful, and he gave me lots of kind of tips. Really, at Barkley, it's really useful to be with someone that's been there before. They call themselves they're known as veterans, and they can give you kind of tips about the course, because it's not really just about map reading. It's about knowing the course, honestly, and knowing what to look for around you, and where kind of how that directs where you should go. So a lot of it is about kind of passing on knowledge. So I ran part of it with Guillaume, and then kind of the last third I sort of ran on my own. And the first day was actually pretty hot. So I was running in 3/4 lengths, and this is as I then came into the changeover, and I had all my pages. I think I ran it in about 9¼ hours. But when I finished that first loop, I was on my own, which was not really ideal going into the night. My legs were pretty scratched from the briars, especially on kind of rat jaw. There's lots of briars there. But going into the night, I then put on long trousers, and I took lots of extra kit with me because the forecast was for pretty heavy rain overnight. And actually, that's what happened. It started raining in the sort of, I don't know, it must have been about 10 or 11 o'clock at night. And it rained all night. And it was, I guess, being Scottish and having done all that training over January and February in the storms, maybe I was just prepared for it mentally. But the weather was appalling. Like it threw it down, buckets of rain all night. And so much so that there's sort of this steep slopes, because it's all really steep there, steep slopes kind of covered with kind of dead leaves. It was just like everything was running with water. The whole world felt like it was running with water. And then on top of that, there was this fog. And so you had to take off your headlamp, obviously, because you can't see with the headlamp on you in the fog. So you're carrying it in your hands, and then you've got these running poles as well. And then you keep falling over in the mud. So yeah, and then you're trying to find your way, and you remember like these vague bits, but it all looks so different than it did in the daytime. And then you had, someone pointing out to look for that tree or this tree, and in the night you can't see those trees. And so, yeah, it was pretty tough, and I got lost quite a bit. And I was really lucky sort of to come together with another runner called Thomas. And we ended up running it together. So 2 brains are always better than 1. And I remember at some points he would take off his waterproof gloves and just turn them upside down, and all this water would come running out of them. So that's how wet it was. And this is me coming in at the end of that second loop. So the first loop I'd done in sort of 9¼ hours. And by the end of the second loop, I only had about 20 minutes left to turn around and get out again before that 24-hour kind of cut off if I wanted to do the 5 loops. So this was me coming in, and actually most of the field had dropped out overnight. So by the time I went out for my third loop, there was only 5 of us left in the race. So lots of kind of big names like Courtney Dawater, and they dropped out overnight with hypothermia. So on the third loop, I was on my own. And this is me just so at the top of the rat jaw is one of the places on the course where some water gets left out. So this is me just collecting water, and this is a photo that Conrad took and before I disappeared back into kind of the undergrowth. This next photo is just to say, like, this is just a photo of my arm afterwards, which I actually still had the bruise for quite a long time afterwards. But what happens is, like, I fell over so much on that third loop because I think the ground was wet, and because you kept falling over, and every time, because you'd sort of end up landing on this bit, and that's the way both of my arms looked at the end of that third loop. So what happened, to kind of cut a long story short, is I finished the third loop very close to the 40-hour cut-off time for a fun run, partly because I got lost several times on that third loop towards the end, and then to kind of cap it, I descended off the final summit slightly the wrong side of the ridge. So, like you're running along a ridge and you think you're right, and then you sort of veer a little bit right, and then you sort of overcorrect it, and that's basically what happened. And I ended up following a stream that was not actually the right stream, and I realised when I came to this sort of big pool and waterfall that I was in the wrong place, and I had half an hour to get back, and it was really stressful. And I ended up sort of trapped in these mountain laurels, and I was sort of doing this belly crawl, and my rucksack was getting trapped by, getting caught by the mountain laurels, these bushes. And I was shouting, and then I was actually running across the sort of mountainside much faster than I'd run for the whole race, because I had this massive surge of adrenaline because I suddenly thought I wasn't going to get back. But I managed to make it back, and I got what's called as a what's classed as a fun run for finishing the 3 loops in 40 hours. So that's how it finished. I was pretty sure I could do better than that. So that's why I went back this year. So before I kind of talk about this year, this is no secret, this is not the map or anything. Well, it is the map, but it's not like with the route or anything. But if you can kind of see, there's really no features on this map at all. This is what the whole map essentially looks like. In fact, there's one place on the map where the grid lines have been, there aren't grid lines on the background. So it's just, for some reason, part of the map doesn't contain that, and it's a state park map. It's their official map. So just to say, like, if you're trying to navigate in this stuff, it's just trees, and then you've got what the kind of the lie of the land underneath your feet. But if it's dark, then who's to know whether you're on, whether you're on this bit there or this bit there, and that will could make a big difference in terms of how easy it is to kind of navigate the terrain. So. Are
you allowed to take a compass?
Yeah, you're allowed a compass. Interestingly, my first time I ran it, my compass broke the first descent because you fall over a lot. So the whole front of the compass came off, but luckily I had a spare one with me. I also broke a pole both of the first 2 loops last year. This year I didn't break a pole, but lots of people did. So people just then pick up a stick and run with a stick. But it's actually surprising how much of a disadvantage it is not to have a pole, because I think because you're going, it's pretty steep. So it makes quite a big difference having a pole. So this is, I decided to go back because I thought I could do better. So this is this is when we came into the campground this year at the start. And I'd had not the ideal kind of training prep. I'd sort of planned all this, I had great visions of how the preparation would go, and how I'd do lots of nighttime orienteering, and how I'd be super fit. And what actually happened was I kind of had some sort of chronic fatigue in autumn, I guess, having 2 small children and working full time and doing lots of running, I don't know. But I was tired, and so I had to kind of back off and sleep more, because I have a full-time job. I don't have the kind of, I can't sleep all the day, so I sort of had to train less, because usually I train at 5 in the morning. And then I also had a knee injury, which kind of flared up in autumn. The surgeon that I saw actually, I did tell him I was a runner and that I do it quite seriously, but at the end he was like, if you want to carry on running, I suggest you can carry on running, but maybe I would stick with kind of soft surfaces and nothing undulating. And he said that to me, and I just got a letter of condolences from Laz to say I had a place, so I didn't. So I thought I probably wouldn't mention that, and and then I sort of got bursitis in that knee over Christmas, so without making any excuses, it wasn't the ideal preparation. But in the end, I got a sort of 6 weeks of pretty solid training in before Barkley. So this was me arriving at the campsite, and I was kind of pretty excited to see everybody again, because there is a core group of people that go, and there's sort of this Barkley family. The year before, we'd kind of gone for pizza on the final night, and that was really lovely. And this year we went to John Kelly's family farm for kind of brunch the day before. It was nice to see everybody and to chat kind of race tactics the day before. So there's kind of this real atmosphere, this real buzz the day before it starts in the camp. And this is me chatting with this guy here, that's Tomo. So he's been lots of years. He was there this year as well. He made it onto the 4th loop with me as well. So I think that's there just to say that I was kind of pensive and excited and nervous beforehand. I actually thought it was going to start in the night. I had a real strong gut feeling that it would start in the night, so I was really prepared for that. So when I woke up in the next morning at 8 a.m, I was very surprised. And then the conch sounded, I think, at 8:54, and so an hour later it started. So the weather this year was incredible. Like, it could not be better. It was freezing cold. So at night, sometimes it must have been -5, -10 on the tops at night. It was really cold, but it meant that the ground was pretty frozen. So instead of like sliding down this kind of mud, it was pretty frozen for the most part. And it was just much easier to kind of cope with like sunny cold than it is to cope with changes in temperature. Like, it was consistently cold, it was consistently sunny, and it was consistently dry. Like, the weather could not have been better. This is on the first day, on the first loop. I kind of ended up running quite a lot of the time with other people. John Kelly and Damien Hall, who I'd sort of ideally would have liked to run with, they got away from me quite quickly on one of the downhills because of my knee, I couldn't descend quite as fast. But I ended up running with Jared Campbell, who's finished it 3 times before, and Carol Sabe, who actually finished this year. So I was with kind of good people on that first loop. And I think I lost them right at the end. But then when I came into the changeover, I did this super fast changeover. So they were just sort of getting ready to go out. And I did a super fast changeover, just sat down literally at the gate, ate some food and left. So I left as they were leaving. I left and sprinted to catch them up. Because there's a real advantage in being with other people during the night. And I didn't want to go into that first night on loop 2 on my own. So I ran with that group. The night time, that first night was all right. I think I benefited from being with them, I stuck with them till kind of the second to last book, and then I had a bit of a bonk. I think I had not really been able to take on quite enough food, and I lost them on that climb, which was unfortunate because then I kind of made a mistake with the book, and by the time I came into the campground for the changeover from 2 to 3, Carol and Jared had already gone. Unbeknown to me, Joe was having a bit of a rest. So on the next climb up to Chimney Top, he that's when he caught me up, and that's when we had that kind of thing of me saying see you at the end of the loop, and then he went awry somewhere, and I carried on the right route. So this is me on the third loop as I came to Ratjaw, where there were some supporters, and then carried on to the end of the third loop, which wasn't too eventful. So going into the fourth loop, I think I only had about 20 minutes spare, under 36 hours, but I did have enough time to get out for the fourth loop. So that was only, I think, the second time a woman's ever got out onto the fourth loop. And it was kind of a mixture of feelings. Like I knew that because I'd lost some time on that kind of third loop, that it was going to be really difficult to get back in 48 hours to start the fifth loop. But at the same time, it was kind of exciting to be getting out onto the fourth loop, because I was like, well, now I'm out there and I can go and do what I can do, and just give everything on this kind of my final hurrah and see what I can do. And it just felt like I was weirdly elated for having got that far on my own, because I'd done quite a lot. All of that third loop I'd done completely on my own, and I actually went on to do the whole of the fourth loop on my own as well. So I think that if I do go back, I have like a lot of experience of running on my own at Barkley, which I think a lot of people don't get when they run with other people. It's a big advantage to be in a group with other people, but it also means that you don't have that kind of core knowledge of the course, which if I ever get onto loop 5, that would be a massive advantage, because I know that I can do it on my own already. I just need to get to loop 5 in time to do that. So the fourth loop, so this is the second night now, that was pretty tough because for lots of reasons. Mainly I kept falling asleep. So for people that have done sort of ultra stuff, the first night's all right. When you go into a second night with no sleep, it starts to get quite difficult to stay awake. So it was pretty cold, but I still had no problem. I was just falling asleep on my feet. And so there's sections of this course where there are some bits where you're on a trail and you're doing these switchbacks, kind of these hairpin turns. And I would just like carry on off the switchback and carry on walking. And then at some point I'd wake up and I'd no longer be on the path, and then I'd be trying to navigate where I left it, So that sort of thing was happening to me quite a lot. And then if you're doing like really the steep up hills, that was the worst, because if I was running like a technical downhill, you have to stay awake. You have to stay awake to be able to move fast. But if you're walking uphill and it's steep and you're going slowly, it's very easy to fall asleep. So I'd just be falling asleep, and it's really difficult to keep focused, because in a race like that, when you're on your own for like 12 hours at a time, you need to keep focused to remember that you're racing for time, and every second counts. But yeah, in the middle of the night, it's very difficult to kind of maintain that focus. I think that's one of the key things about this race. And as I've said before, power naps can be really useful if you're that sleep deprived. But on this race, I was too scared to do it because I thought I won't wake up. And what John Kelly actually did, because everybody seemed to have problems on that second night. John Kelly actually lay down on a book, knowing that the person behind him wasn't far away, and that they would have to wake him up when they got to the book. But I was the last person on Loop 4, so I couldn't do that. So yeah, I just have to work out kind of what my strategy will be for next year. But yeah, I mean, it would. I think even Laz. I don't think Laz has ever said it, but it wouldn't be within the kind of ethos of this race to take any sort of an alarm with you. That's like out of the question. That's part of the challenge of it, is that you will stay asleep in the wood for 6 hours. You know, that's what he would probably chuckle at that. You know, so. Yeah, so we'll see what I did. I mean, I ate caffeine gels and so on, but didn't. It was still a pretty big challenge. But yeah, so it got to the next day, and I got to kind of the third last book around the time when the 48 hours clicked by. So I knew that I wasn't going to get back in time to set out for Loop 5. But by that point, I was almost. It wasn't very much difference to get those last few pages or to go straight back. And to be honest, I didn't even know that there was any sort of rule that you're supposed to go straight back. I carried on to get my last few pages. And yeah, so it was interesting because the last couple of times I was having all sorts of hallucinations, which I've had before when I'm sleep deprived, but this time was a little bit different. So I often hallucinate animals. So I was hallucinating all sorts of animals. And also sculptures. This time there was a lot of modern sculptures in the woods, which I just saw, and I'd be like, oh, that's really interesting, but why put it here? I mean, it's gonna be so underappreciated here. There's only me to see it. But then, having said that, there was also, I started getting joined by all my kind of friends and family, and had quite a lot of conversations, actually mainly about the fact that it couldn't possibly be so far to go up the hill, because I actually, in my head, I believed I was hallucinating, because I was hallucinating so much stuff, that then I started to believe I was hallucinating the next bit of hill that I could see, because I didn't think, in my mind, it couldn't possibly be that far to the top of that hill, and then another bit would appear. So instead of thinking, well, it's just that's the way it is in the mountains, isn't it? I started to think I was hallucinating that bit. And the only thing that was weird to me was that the ground kept matching what I could see, under my feet. So anyway, yeah, and I had as Conrad was there, my brother was there. At some point, I was back to being a small child with my parents ahead, and us kind of trailing behind, saying how much further is it type thing. So yeah, it was really kind of interesting. So I got to the top of that last climb. I found the book, I found the page, and I just started this kind of long, slow descent, because it's quite a long descent if you're on that particular direction to get back to the campground. And as I came over the last kind of little rise, there was a body lying across the trail. And at first I thought it's just another hallucination, but as I got closer it was still there. And it turned out it was Damien. So he wasn't looking like this at this point, he was asleep. He was asleep across the trail, and I got to him and I was like, in my head there was something in my back of my head saying, you should probably wake him up. He probably doesn't want to be sleeping here. So I woke him up and I was like, Damien, wake up. Are you meant to be sleeping here? And then he opened his eyes and he was like, are you okay? And I was like, and it's like this in my kind of foggy state of mind. I was thinking, this is a bit ironic, isn't it? I mean, you're the one lying on the floor asleep. But I must have looked pretty bad. So there's kind of followed this slightly weird conversation when Damien asked me, did you find the book? And I was like, which one? The one at Chimney Top? And we concluded that's the one he meant. And I was like, yeah, it was where it's supposed to be. And he was like, oh, I couldn't find it. I brought back a leaf and a bit of rock to prove I was there. And then I was like, we're in a forest surrounded by leaves and rocks. And then he was like, but that wouldn't work, would it? And I was like, no. And he said, I left some biscuit as well. So I had this like sort of this vision, this kind of image in my head of Laz climbing up to this mountain to look for these bits of biscuit. I was like, should we go back together, Damien? Because at this point, Damien had basically been looking for the book for an hour, given up, fallen asleep, and that's when I kind of found him on the way back. So he'd already started Loop 5, but unfortunately that's what kind of he'd come to, he'd failed to find the first book on Loop 5, probably largely due to kind of sleep deprivation, because he was as as he was having similar sort of hallucinations to me. So we ended up walking back, kind of jogging the last bit back into camp together. And this is, these are a couple of videos. I don't actually know if the video will work, because often, oh, maybe it will. Oh yeah, this is just finishing the fourth loop then. At which point Laz said to me whether I thought I could do, I don't think you can hear it, whether I still thought I could do 5 loops. And I said that I thought I could. And then the other video is, so at the end of so you get tapped out when you finish, well, actually when you fail to finish, they tap you out. So somebody plays this like bugle music for you. So this happens for every finisher, whether you run like 200 meters or whether you run 4.5 loops, you get this kind of taps, they call it. Yeah. So I think that's it. So in terms of kind of saying whether I was being honest when I said that I think I can finish it. Laz is known to have said, I think Laz has been asked a lot of times whether a woman can finish this race. And I think he would really like a woman to finish the race. His argument is looking at finishing times. If you take an average, if you look at the kind of, in general, in kind of elite races, a man's finishing times generally 10 to 12% faster than the woman's finishing time. So if you took that for Barkley, then you'd say a woman can't finish it because the men's finishing times are generally sort of, I mean, this year they were sort of, I don't know, probably 59.5 to 55 minutes type period. There was very little kind of free time. My argument would be that at Barkley, it's not just about speed. There's so much, it's like, that might apply to a 100-mile race where it's on trails and where it's about pure kind of physical ability to run fast. But at Barkley, it's really not. There's so many other factors that play into it. So I still think it's possible. But I think if I go back, it'll only be if I feel like I can really give it a really good shot. So I would need to be on top form. And then things would need to go right. So this year the weather was really good. So you probably it's unlikely you're going to get that good weather again next year. Maybe in the next 10 years, but it would be very lucky to get it again next year. Yeah, and then things have to go right. You have to not make up a massive mistake when you're navigating. Yeah, the weather has to play ball. So we'll see what happens. But hopefully I'll go back again to prove that it can be done. I think. I just have a few slides right at the end, and these will be really quick, just to mention the green runners, because there is the kit swap today was kind of just, I guess, a little bit inspired by the green runners. I am part of this kind of movement. So just to tell you the story, there's this kind of came together. The green runners are like a community-based group of runners, and we're basically focused on helping to make the world around us a better place. So the aim is to sort of get runners thinking about their footprint in terms of their carbon footprint and just generally in their running footprint. And I think that extends then into kind of everyday life once you start thinking about it. There was a group of runners that came together after COP26 kind of feeling a bit frustrated about the lack of action and then sort of thinking, what can we do within our community to start to kind of push for change? So it's based, we think that everybody can be a green runner and you don't have to be perfect. I'm certainly very much not. You just have to kind of be thinking about the planet and kind of making your decisions. So it's based around 4 pillars: how you move, how you dress, how you eat, and how you speak out. So I'm not going to go through those. I'm going to just tell you briefly. So thinking about how you move, flying to races is obviously much worse than any other way of getting there. So I obviously flew to Barkley, so feel free to throw that right back at me. I have tried to so Barkley's the only race I flew to, and I decided not to apply for Hard Rock because I'd applied for Barkley. But still, generally if you can get to races by land, sea, bike, then that's significantly better. So I travelled to the UTMB last year by train. I'm travelling to the World Championships in Innsbruck this year by train and to the Tour de Géant. So it's just kind of trying to make those decisions. Maybe just fly to fewer races and decide what's really important for you, kind of prioritise. How you dress, so if you can swap kit, not buy new, if you can change it, repair it, think about whether you really need new kit. That's, because the impact that kind of the new kit that we buy has a massive impact. So starting to think about that. How you eat, so I don't need to kind of lecture people about the fact that eating less red meat and less dairy is better for the planet. And then how you speak out, and I think this is really important collectively as a community, and that's where we can kind of push for change. And that might be something like emailing your race organizer to say, can you move the start time of the race to fit with a train arriving at the station to make that possible. So it might even be as little as that, or talking to your friend and saying, this is why I've decided to swap this piece of kit rather than buying a new piece of kit. So little steps, and I feel like quite passionately that, like, as I say, I'm learning all the time, and I think that once you start to make little changes, then they kind of snowball, and it's much better that we all make an effort and accept the fact that we're not, that I feel like this, I feel like a real hypocrite talking about it, but at the same time I think it's better that I talk about it and make an effort than pretend that it's not happening and not say anything at all. So that's the Green Runners. So if you want to check the Green Runners out, even if you just want to look at the website, because there's like really loads of helpful tips, like how to repair your shoes, and there's going to be like lots of advice for race organisers, and it's all free. If you want to become a member, it's like £2.50, and it's just to cover kind of the running costs, because it's all volunteer led. And even better if you want to get involved, that'd be fantastic. But there's a website, the Green Runners, and also we're on Twitter and Facebook and stuff. That's my little spiel at the end of it. Hopefully you didn't mind me saying that. And that's it. So if you want to ask any questions about Barkley or anything else, I'd be very happy to answer those.
Are there any wild animals?
So there are for sure wild animals. Interestingly, so it'd been really warm the few days before the race, and Damien, who had been like running around in the park just on the trails, but he'd seen a rattlesnake, and he sent me a picture of it. So I was really glad that it was cold. So apparently that's very unusual. John Kelly's, their family farmed there for years and years and years, like generations, and this early to have rattlesnakes out was very unusual. It's because it had been so warm. But by the time we got to the race, it cooled down, and surely it went back into kind of hibernation. But for me, thinking about that, because when you're out there, you're so on your own, for those 12 hours. And as I say, the park's not that big; it's like 20 miles across or something. But when you're there and in those hills up and down, and it's so kind of wild that it doesn't make a difference that you're at that distance, that it's not that big a park, because it feels very isolated, and you have no way of, like, if you broke your leg, you'd have to just wait for someone to come find you, because you've got no way of, you can't call anybody, you've got no way at all of letting people know where you are. And if you're not on the right path, then you just have to wait for, I don't know what they would do, to be honest. Get dogs out or something. I had a whistle on my rucksack, yeah, so you'd whistle. But yeah, so the rattlesnakes, and then the first year I ran it, that night, there was a point, and I'm sure it probably wasn't anything, but anything bad. But when I looked up at one point in the kind of mist and rain, there was two eyes watching me from a cliff above me. So I don't know what it was, but something big. And there aren't sheep. It's not the sort of place you'd meet a sheep, So I don't know what it was.
You mentioned about sleep. My experience of long events is Paris cycling, which is 90-hour limit, and the general best strategy is to go straight through the first night, and the second night get 90 minutes, which is 2 REM cycles optimum for getting your eyes and mind back into order. Did you have any planned sleep break in this, or is it just ad hoc naps?
I think that would be ideal, like that would be lovely. And like on the Spine, when I slept for roughly 2 hours on the second night, that was all I needed, and I managed to go through the third night virtually not sleeping at all. But the problem is at Barkley, there's just not that time left. Like it comes down to like I should have said that. Three people finished this year. John Kelly finished for the second time. Aurelian Sanchez incredibly finished on his first attempt. And Carol Sabe, who I ran with part of the time this year and last year. So 3 people finished. It was an incredible year, partly because of the weather. But none of the people, as far as I'm aware, slept except for like micro sleeps on the course. It's just no time, you know. And when it comes down to sort of, I mean, Carol finished with something like 6 minutes to spare. You can imagine what everybody's like in the campsite waiting for him to come in. You know, after being out there for 60 hours. And you're looking, we saw a head torch on the kind of ridge, and you're like, that's him. And then everybody's looking at their watches, can you make it back, you know? Because you're so behind them. It's sort of like, it's like this, it's so intense there. It's like the whole experience is so intense. But yeah, to answer your question, there's just not time. I don't think there's time to sleep properly. Maybe for 5-10 minutes. But it's difficult to sleep when you're in the camp, because that's the bit of time when you've got all this adrenaline, you know, and all these people to stimulate you.
The other thing I'd like to mention, because you were talking about how a woman finishing Barkley as a long, difficult event and so on, I have a email from about 1995 recording an event of 2,000-mile race held in Monterey. 9 people entered. Only the woman finished within the time limit, and I put that down to endurance and ability to withstand boredom and stuff. So that's a good example of a massive race which a woman did better than any of the men. The ironic thing about that, 2,000 miles on a 400-meter running track.
Yeah, no, sometimes I feel like Barkley could do with maybe even, like, to play into the kind of woman thing for that, could do with being longer, do you know? Because like 60 hours is maybe not quite long enough to make that kind of female advantage count as much.
It seems to be designed to totally mess with your mind. Do you think that Barkley, you seem immune to it, do you think that Barkley kind of encourages and benefits that type of person who just doesn't get impacted by the outside stuff? Or is it the traditional, like, amazing ultra runner that will succeed in this?
So I think there's a few things. I think, yes, to some extent. Like, I think you have to be really focused, and you have to be able to put that aside. Like, it's interesting because if you look at the people that have finished Barkley, quite a lot of them are, I think posts have been written about this, quite a lot of them are like science, like engineering kind of types. So whether that plays into it at all, even if just the sort of finding the books and maybe just the kind of logical kind of thing of it, I don't know. But what I would say is that I think Barkley is a race that, so people that are like, you can have really elite athletes, but they don't necessarily always do that well at Barkley. I know not that many of them try, but some have. And I think part of that maybe is down to this kind of, there's a lot of mental resilience in Barkley. I think a lot of it comes down to being able to like cope with the unpredicted and like just try, you know, just like put it to one side and keep going kind of thing. There's not much room for error, but there will be some errors, but you have to just like keep going even when it gets hard, and to kind of put that aside and like be super focused. So it's kind of a combination of things. It's rare as well for people to finish on their first attempt, so people come back, and that's actually a big ask in itself, because it's not like, a lot of this is type 2 fun. So it's, you know, like going back for another try, like a picture of me before the race, like you knew what you were letting yourself in for. It's not, I mean, it's going to hurt, you know, so if you weren't like really committed to it, you would just not go back. Yeah.
If it's, I have 2 quick questions. If it's not you, who are your bets on to be the first female to finish? And also, like with hard rock, you know how like the number of females on the start line is proportional to the number of entrants? Does Laz do anything like that, or do you not know?
I don't know what Laz does with his entries. I don't think anyone does. I think Laz is keen for a woman to finish. Like, I would say that if there are women with like a good kind of good chance, or kind of like a good kind of record, or that sort, he'll give them a place. So I'm not really. I mean, I could probably think of other women that would. Yeah, I've not thought about one specific woman in answer to your question. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are lots, you know, there are other women, but they've got to want it. Like, I think, Because that's the difficult thing for me to say, which woman, because I think there's lots of women that are physically capable of doing it. But like, I feel like it has to come from, like, you have to really want it. And that's why part of the reason I didn't apply for it until the point when I really wanted it, because I think there's no point in going to this race unless you're super committed. And that's a bit like on Loop 4 when I went out, it was the likelihood of me getting back in time to finish and start Loop 5 was pretty small, but I still went out like, I'm going to do as much as I can. Like, that would be beneficial for if I were to go back as a kind of recce, but it's also because like I was going to kind of go out all guns blazing, still trying type thing. You have to drag me home. So I think that has to be your kind of attitude to it. Yeah.
Second topic of sleep deprivation. Did you do anything as part of your training to prepare for that?
No, and so all I did really was try and sleep as much as I could beforehand. And for me, actually, because we went out without the kids, and so I actually got 3 nights of good sleep beforehand, and that's actually quite a big deal for me. So that was quite nice.
Having the kids is basically preparation.
Yeah. It's funny because the spine, people ask me that quite a lot, because at the time my daughter was sleeping pretty badly. She was just 1 year, she was like 14 months or something, and I was still breastfeeding her at night, like multiple times a night. So I don't know whether that maybe helped a bit, but equally that could have been the hormones like allowing me to do that. I don't know. But I'm not convinced that sort of training yourself for sleep deprivation is going to be that helpful. I feel like the best thing is to try and bank this and be well rested going into it.
How long did you sleep for afterwards?
Just like, I finished, by the time we got back after, because people finished, it was like 10 o'clock at night, we stayed at the campsite for that. I hadn't I fell asleep on the kind of camping mat outside while people were walking around the campsite. And then I think we went back to the kind of, we'd hired an accommodation about 10, but then we had a flight out back to New York at 9 the next morning, or 11 the next morning, so we had to be at the airport at 9, so it wasn't like a super long sleep. It's difficult to sleep that long though after something like this, because you wake up in the morning, everything hurts, it's not like you get it's usually a few nights on when you can kind of really fall asleep and sleep well, I found. Yeah.
You mentioned there's these named places, and the Rat Draw.
Yeah.
It's called. You could see there's a bit of a track.
Yeah.
So does a trail develop, and does it in any way? Now, the other thing is, like you mentioned, John Kelly lives in that area. Do people go and recce? Do they go and familiarise themselves, not necessarily with the route, but with the terrain and the ground they've got to run?
So I think people go, like, so Damien this year was out there a week early and ran the trails. You're absolutely not allowed off the trails. So I think any knowledge that John Kelly has come either from before when he was a kid and he ran in the park and stuff, definitely went off trail then when he was a kid, or from the fact that he's run the race now like 4 or 5 times, I think 4 times. So that's his kind of, he knows the route well. But in general, no, because there's no way a trail would develop where there's once a year 40 runners go around it. In fact, most people are not running the same trail. That was part of the joke. I sort of said running the 5 loops of the same course. Well, I was grateful when I was running the same way twice, because like most of the time you're trying to be on the same path, but it's incredible because one time you'll get it completely spot on and the next time you really don't. So and there's no way of kind of, there's, you can think you're going to get it right, but the next time, Barkley has a way of doing that to you, just as you're sort of feeling confident and good and like you know what you're doing, it's like, no, you don't, So, there's no way a trail develops. But that Rat Draw, there's a path there. That's one of the places where there's a bit of a path. And actually, that's the place that always appears in the pictures, but it's not, that top bit is not very steep. So that bit that you see in the pictures is not very steep. It's the bit over the edge of that's super steep. In fact, the year that I did it in the rain, we basically slid the whole way down, a kilometre or something on our bottoms. There's just no way of standing up because you kept falling over. And the only way to get back up is there's this kind of tubing, this pipe, and you could pull yourself back up on the other way down. As I say, it's something to do with this prison and the kind of fire tower. But most of the places, there's nothing like that. But in answer to your question, there's no paths on the bits that aren't trail.
Are the books buried?
No, actually finding the books when you're in the right place is not generally, it's not like you're in the right place and you're kind of doing a deep, like having to dig or anything like that. If you're in the right place, you'll generally find the book. It's being in the right place that's the difficulty.
kind of cut easily, but not like really still.
I think it depends who you are to some extent. So I was running, most of the time I had a map out. There are some bits where it's a mix of things. So like I use the map and a compass a lot of the time, like on descents and ascents, like and I was constantly trying to check and things, but the map isn't that good. And there's a lot of the bits I sort of mentioned before where you're kind of more looking for things to guide you, and that's knowledge that gets passed down from people that have run it before, and that's why being with a veteran is really helpful. I think John Kelly moves through it as if he just knows it like his backyard, but you'd say that to you looks like any other bit of forest, but he just knows the way to go, so I think the more times you run it, the more that becomes second nature. And that'd be much faster if you could move like that than trying to like constantly look at a map. There's lots of features that aren't on the map. It's not like an OS map. It's like very far from that. So like, I mean, there's one place where there's a river, and I reconfirmed it this year, that's not on the map. So I mean, it's not a stream, it's a river.
Have you come back and made kind of notes for yourself to remember?
Yeah.
What did you eat?
Like I generally find that eating proper food's better on doing ultra stuff, and I try to just save gels for when I'm like having a like real energy bonk, because it kind of helps get me back to being able to eat proper food again. So I ate things like, I had like homemade flapjack with me, I had some sandwiches, I had some like trail mix type stuff, I had sweets, I had chocolate, I had pizza, cold pizza, and then when I was in camp I ate porridge or pasta, chocolate oat milk, and there was also, the crew were going out for this like local fast food like called Sonic, which is like your McDonald's of Tennessee, and they were going out to get that, and so I got like leftovers of that as well when I came through the campground, which was really nice. Genuinely really nice. So like kind of cold fries and stuff, but at the time it tasted really good. So yeah, generally just save gels for when kind of really need them. And that caffeine, I was like desperate for anything that would wake me up. Because at one point I had to change my head torch and it just went dark, and I was like, oh, it'd be so nice to just go to sleep. I was like, wake up. Hitting yourself to wake yourself up. Okay. Yeah?
There's still such a small number of women compared to men that are trying to do the race, and still like a relatively small number of women on the start line. Will probably be at that level in other races as well. Is there anything that you want to see change in the general world of running to make that easier and get more women there in the first place?
Yeah, I sometimes feel like some ultra events are... It's interesting because I remember at the start of the Dragon's Back, when I ran it in 2015, I think it was Helen said to us all when we were sitting there in a room, they were like, if you're a woman, you've got 90% chance of finishing. If you're a man, a 50% chance. And that was interesting. And that part of the reason, theoretically, for that, whether those stats are exactly right. But I do think there's a thing of like men are more confident to take on things, whereas women are a bit more cautious. So they tend to be better prepared when they actually do take it on. So I think sometimes races bill themselves as the most extreme, the most the most dangerous, the most ultra, the most tough, and sometimes I think that might put some women off. So I don't know quite what the answer to that is, because I guess the race organisers kind of use that to kind of hype up their race. But I hope that, for example, me talking about stuff is like inspiring other women to have a go. I guess the kind of natural things would be like big events like Hard Rock's been very good. The UTMB has been super slow on that, but things like maternity policies. So like it's abominable that the UTMB didn't have any policy like on letting you defer your entry when you're pregnant, for example. Because I asked them that one year and they were like, no, you wouldn't be allowed to do that if that happened. So that sort of thing, much better. And then I guess things just making it easier for women when they're on their periods, maybe on races and things. Those are kind of things, but hopefully kind of role models and showing what can be done. Like Courtney Delwater's incredible, Camille Herron, I think they're kind of proving that women can compete on an equal footing with men, these things. So,
One thing would you change in your
Yeah. I think ideally the prep beforehand would be a bit better, so I'd feel a little bit more confident about that. Because I think there were a few times I can kind of look back on and think, like that second loop, if I'd managed to stay with Carol and Jared on that climb, and I knew that, and I knew they were getting away from me, I just like bonked, and I think part of the reason I bonked was because I'd sort of been hanging on to them a bit at the whole of loop 2, and it just sort of, I could tell it was happening. I started to shake, and I was like, I'm not, but the problem is, and Damien described this as well, like if you're hanging on to a group like that, there's no time, like it's not like anybody's going to wait for you, you know, like everybody's out there to finish it, you know, so it's good to be in a group, but nobody's waiting for anyone, you know, like, so if you drop off the pace, it's not like people are going to say, oh, I will wait for you at the top of this hill type thing. It's just they're gone, you know. And then so I think if it would have only been like a few 5% difference, but then that would have made the difference, I think, and that would have been a big advantage. So that I think I would just again try to go back and do a bit more nighttime orienteering, even though, as Laz points out, it's not specifically a navigation event, but it's helpful to not make the big mistakes. I think, again, that's down to sleep as well, isn't it? I think a little bit of it's luck. It definitely is a big advantage to have done it before. So I like look back on that and my experience and all those notes I've got written down at home, and they're kind of like the ultra top secret documents I now have at home. Yeah, and then I think that will all help me, stand me in good stead. Yeah. Yeah. You have to reapply every year. My essay was significantly shorter this year, along those lines.
How many spectators are there?
You're only allowed one crew member for each runner. So Conrad came and crewed me. And then there was quite a few television crews this year as well. So Conrad was kind of joking, there's more television crews here than runners, but they were like fairly low key. But in general, just one crew member. And then this kind of Laz has this group of friends that sort of, like there'll be people that ran, some of them will have run like half a loop 20 years ago or something, but they're like part of the scene. You're like, they talk about the time that they ran, and yeah, that's sort of, they stand around the campfire and as I say, barbecue this chicken. It's part of it.
I think I saw I think it was April the 1st, so I'm guessing it was a spoof, and it might have been Damien wrote it about a Barkley Marathon in the UK.
Yeah, it was a spoof.
Yeah, well, it was, but do you think could it happen in the UK? Because part of this is about the terrain and the forest, perhaps. So could there be a UK version? I mean, I know it's a spoof, but I mean,
I think you could.
In Noida or somewhere like that, you know, that is probably really out of the way.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's no reason why not to have something like that. I don't know. I don't think you could. It wouldn't be the same race, but you could have a race of similar idea. You need someone to kind of. I think you need someone to mastermind it a little bit, the way Laz has. It's not the easiest. Like he genuinely has created something a bit unique there. But I'm not saying. I think you could have another event that would also be unique, that would kind of test a similar way. But yeah, it's pretty kind of.
How did you cope with the complete absence of distant views?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. There are a few places on the course where you get a view, and this year I noticed them more than the year before, because like the year before I felt like I was always in the forest. And this year was a couple of points, like on the loop 4, there was sunrise. I was on top of a place called Stallion Mountain, and the sunrise was spectacular. And I remember thinking like, wow, you know, because I think on the spine I had a feeling like that on the final kind of evening. And it was, again, one of those moments you're probably going to remember for the rest of your life, that sunrise at that point. Because I suddenly, like, you just took a moment to, like, in the kind of rush of this kind of focus, you suddenly, like, looked at the sky and looked at the kind of... So there are some places, and that's a particular place that stands out in my memory. And obviously at Ratjaw, you kind of see down the slope there. But there's not that many places like that a lot of the time you're in trees. And that's also like, even at night, there's a lot of the time you wouldn't see, there might be head torches around, but you only see them generally when you get onto a ridge or something, then you might see a head torch there or there. But a lot of the time you have no idea, like once people are even not that far ahead, they're gone, you know, even, and you have no kind of trace and way of following them unless you're right behind them. Any more?
Did you have any fear, or if you did fall and you injured yourself? I mean, being out in the dark and with no way of contacting anyone.
Yeah, for sure. And I think maybe once you have kids, it kind of becomes more of a factor. I think it was comforting to me to know that Conrad was there, because like I've done lots of mountain stuff with Conrad, and like we like have a very inherent, like I have real trust in him. Like if there wasn't any other person that I'd want there than Conrad, like I would trust him to kind of, I mean, he'd still have to find me, but I think he's, I think, you know, like if I was going to have anybody to try and sort that mess out, it would be him. So that, and also like I guess I wouldn't put myself into a situation, if I knew I was really in a bad way, I would just turn around. I would either come back or get myself into a position where I'd be more easily bound type thing. I wasn't going to kind of, I think I've got some limits, like I sort of would realise at that point. There was no point during this attempt that I felt like I was like on the cusp of really hitting the wall. I should say, by the way, my comment about the men standing around the campfire, some of them have done, like, you know, in general, you know, they've got, there's like, for example, there's Ed Furtor, who was the first guy that finished the kind of shorter course, and he's an incredible character, and, you know, in general, I was kind of joking a little bit there, in case anybody gets the message back, but yeah, there's this like real group of kind of characters that attend every race.
So once you're on the course, it's only the runners and nobody else.
Yeah, except for that one place at the top of Rat Jaw, yeah.